Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the Left Pocket Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. On today's episode, I will be speaking with my co-host Richard after a very long hiatus on my part. And for those of you who listened to the last episode, you will know why. But we are back in business and talking today. We're going to hash it out a little bit about some news items and personal feelings about what's going on with the left, perhaps in the US, but also elsewhere, and kind of just shoot the SHIT on anything that we feel like over the next few minutes. So come on and join us. Welcome. How's it going, Richard?
All right, still kicking, still here.
I laugh because we had a very long conversation prior to this, like starting this call. We were just like, yeah, America is a hot mess, or like US is a hot mess on so many fronts, but in ways that affect us personally, and I'm sure affect many of you all. So it's always, I used to feel like, you know, when I would ask like, how are you? It was like a just like being polite thing, right? Like, you know, you just ask like, oh, hey, how you doing? Right. But now every time I say how you doing, I like regret it because I feel bad. Like I shouldn't be asking. I'm like, I know how a lot of people are doing and they're not doing great. I should just be like, how can I support you? I feel like that's the best. Instead of saying, hi, how are you doing? I should say like, hi, how can I support you? You know?
Yeah. Like, how are you doing? You may be dealing with somebody having an emotional breakdown in the next few minutes just because
Yes.
it's hard out there in this, and there's doesn't seem to be a lot of light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of folks. And so like even just getting the opportunity to express how, down in the dirt you feel can be the a light for somebody because we're all in this kind of desperation state, I think, in many ways.
It's true. I mean, like a few months ago, I talked to one of my advisors after like a really long time of not having made a peep on my end, just because I've been so overwhelmed and busy and trying to like manage all of this. And you know, she asked me like, hi, how are you? And I literally broke down in tears.
Right.
I'm laughing, but it's not funny. You know, it's not funny. It's just absurd. But like, just the words, how are you right now are triggering kind of, you know, like it's rough. And I think, yeah, it's in ways that I never thought I would be quite at. But it is what it is. So yeah, like I said, I think I like in this moment, I'm realizing that maybe instead of saying how are you, I should say how as I said, how can I support you? What do you need help with? You know, like what can I do to maybe just help a little bit or something, you know? What do you need, right? Is maybe a better way of framing things. So today, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about some items in the news and things that are going on that are like top of mind for us. Richard, I'm actually going to let you have the floor first and kind of introduce anything that's on your mind that you wanted to talk about. And then we can go from there.
Oh, I guess one of the things that's been caught my attention recently, and well, I thought it might be lighter, but I can already see how it could turn to even also dark. But the AI stuff and like what that means for the future of work, for the future of humanity, for the future of business, for the future, for like everyone's future really, and like uh, how that's affecting what we see as what we need to do to make that future not miserable, and
Mm.
so like uh there's been more recently was the Chat GPT, but before that was like Dolly, which was the art version. Chat GPT is kind of a customer service type platform, but I think there's a lot of potential there. And I guess one of the things that came to my mind that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about is uh, obviously we know that the training of AI or machine learning is kind of a broader term that is probably more accurate in many cases, because when people think of AI, they think of more what people in AI refer to as AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, something that would be more human-like, versus machine learning, which takes data and can learn from it and then make decisions about how to react to similar looking data in the future and moving forward. And so like how that data, how AI is trained has a lot to do with what kind of results it produces. And we've seen in the early stages of AI some of those pull out. And one of the big ones was that there was a biased data set for facial recognition that resulted in some facial recognition apps like classifying Black people as monkeys, for example. And so like the learning process for AI is limited by the data that's put into it. And so one of the things that, like, for instance, ChatGPT, one of the points that they make is it doesn't have access, it itself doesn't have access to the internet, so it can't look things up outside of its assigned data set. And one of the reasons is because as soon as you let AI learn from the internet, it learns all of the most atrocious things that we convince ourselves aren't really a major part of humanity, or have been pushed down, or that we've matured beyond, so on and so forth. All those kind of narratives fall apart when a machine takes the data that we produce and interprets it. It consistently results in showing that our society is racist, sexist, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think I'm not as I guess I would say I haven't been keeping up with it as much as you, but I have been seeing a lot of stuff recently about art and AI, and a lot of like understandably very upset artists. And I've been thinking of it very much around the question of labor, right? And how we think about labor, and ways that like AI could potentially be helpful, but also really harmful, especially to people who are doing independent kind of work, that doesn't necessarily allow for formal unionization or for worker protections in the same way that we would think of in a more formal sense. But even then in the US, like even formal labor is not protected well by unions. So issue for another day. But I think there's been, you know, like on the one hand, I think that AI could be really helpful for in medicine, for example, in health and medicine for basic things, but obviously nothing that could replace having an actual doctor or, you know, NP or someone working with you. And I think it's really dangerous to try to put everything onto AI. I also think that I think what you raised about the screen, or sorry, not screen learning, but like the surveillance state and its use of AI, and how things are being misidentified or people are being misidentified in the process, particularly around like face readings and whatnot, right? And I think there's some questions to be asked about what that means for security, especially for leftists and people of color and leftists of color, because one of the things I remember that it was happening in the past was not just the like classification of Black people as monkeys, but also a frequent case of misrecognition of Black people, or like misidentification of people of color in general, not just Black people, but like non-white people, right, who were being mistakenly categorized as other people or as suspects, right? And you're like, oh my God, what does that introduce? And I even think about like basic things, like when I get a speeding ticket that's because of like a camera that took a picture on the expressway, but I've noticed that like we have, so in Baltimore we have all these monitors that like show you the speed that you're going on certain expressways. So shout out to folks in Baltimore who ever have to take I-83 and know what I'm talking about. But they huh?
We
No,
just
go
have
ahead.
similar thing. We
Oh,
have a
you do?
similar
You
thing,
have
and that
some.
I know the like looking down at my speedometer to make sure that that traffic isn't leading me into destruction. Go ahead,
Yeah.
sorry.
And like if they're wrong sometimes though. So that's it's really scary. And that's why I'm like, what do you do? Like if you get, because I got a speeding ticket and then I was like, the reason that this is a very short story, I promise, guys, but basically the area where they have a lot of the cameras set up is like when it's transferring between the county and the city. So in the county you can go like 70 miles an hour, it's no problem, but then once you get to the city you're not supposed to go over 50, like for this particular expressway. So obviously there's a 20-mile-an-hour difference between city and county, and there's a line there, and right at that line they have a camera. So your car cannot decelerate 20 miles in an instant quite like that. So if you don't realize that the border's coming up, which I didn't at the time, you can't like decelerate fast enough to not get a ticket, and they do that on purpose.
Mhm.
But it's the other thing too, is like when you're trying to go around someone, right? Like if you're going in the fast lane and you're going fast just to go around someone so that, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
you're not going fast because you want to go fast. You're going fast to go around, and then you're going to go back to your normal speed. But like they also catch people doing that. But what I've noticed is that the monitors sometimes are wrong, like by several miles an hour. And it could make a difference. Like if it's not properly identifying what the car speed is, and then you're getting a ticket for it, that's a problem. You know what I mean? And while it's better than dealing with a real live cop sometimes, because depending on your race or your gender or whatever, how you look, it may mean death for you, or the cop that you get that day. It's all so there's so many factors that are like relative to that particular moment that are very, very dangerous. But at the same time, it's like if you're someone who's poor and you're getting a bunch of tickets because the monitors messed up, and then you're then also forced to go to court. If you want to dispute it, you can't dispute it in any other way but in person, and then you have to pay court fees and all this, you know what I mean? Like there's no guarantee you're going to win. It's just dangerous on all fronts, from not only a financial perspective but also just like thinking about COVID. Then you got to get childcare, then you got to get off work that day, and blah blah. Like it's not easy, and that's on purpose. And so in thinking about AI, I'm thinking about like machines in general doing things for us, and assessing situations. There are benefits, but also obviously I'm more, I think, maybe there's like a slight bit of like Luddite tendencies that I have, but I don't know. The, it doesn't seem like it would be a good idea on many fronts. And I know for sure, like when we think about the kind of devolution or regression of social media and stuff like that, things that were once promised to be the quote unquote future, or like to innovate or to change society, and that ended up really hurting us and like really hurting young people in particular, I'm less and less hopeful about the potential that it may have, and certainly more concerned about the dangers that it poses.
Well, it's funny is Luddites get a bad rap, like
Yeah.
colloquially, but like really, like they're like you're very right in that you're just being skeptical of what the dangers that the new technology present. Not that you're opposed to the new technology because it's a new technology, which is what people tend to associate that with. And it's like
Hmm.
that's the indoctrination propaganda of Western capitalism. Like
Exactly. Like they're
the
criticizing the system, not the technology, right? Like it's the use of that technology in a hyper capitalist system. Like this is, you know what I mean? Like it reminds me also of like if you're doing any sort of art or like creative writing, and you're asked to look at an object, but everyone's looking at the object from a different perspective, right? So like, you know
Mhm.
what I'm talking about, right? When they have those like drawing classes or writing classes, and you're supposed to describe or draw what you see, and everyone, depending on their angle in the room, is going to come away from it with a different result. And so like when it comes to technology, I think of technology as like that object, but depending on your perspective in the room, like you're going to be coming away with some very different ways of thinking about that technology. And I know for
Mhm.
sure, like in a capitalist system, and like this is like almost one and the same here, but saying it almost feels redundant to say, but like a very racist and sexist and homophobic and whatever capitalist system, it's not going to be anything that's going to be to our benefit. It's going to be to the benefit of the hyper wealthy, and the power systems that keep poor people where they still are.
Yeah, your mention of perspective just made me think of that new MLK statue that was.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw that, but that
I have
that's
seen it.
unfortunate.
Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about it because I've been kind of following it, but that's an important thing to bring up, especially considering tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day. Uh, so I don't know. I'm just saying right now, I'm admitting ignorance, but I've seen like blips and bits and pieces of headlines, and I know that the artist said that it has to do with an embrace between Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King,
Yeah,
and
there's like a
so
photo that
yeah,
you
so
probably.
apparently
Yeah.
like it's not as bad, I guess, as people think it is, but I don't know the conscious, like, did people just think it was ugly, or like why were people so up in arms about it? And sorry, that's my
Basically,
child in the background to wishing me happy birthday. It's not my birthday, but she likes to tell me happy. She likes to come into my room and sing happy birthday, everyone. So
I don't want to interrupt you.
Mama.
Oh, it's so cute.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Miss Selena. Sleep.
Okay, let her go to sleep. Bye, sweetie. Thank you.
That's sweet.
Happy birthday.
I'm glad you had fun singing happy birthday. Okay. Sorry, everyone. That was an interlude from my child. She just woke up from a nap, so she wanted to come and say hi and happy birthday, apparently. Anyway, sorry about that. So you were saying, my apologies.
No problem. About the MLK statue is basically what happened is that depending on the angle, the perspective that you're looking at it from, on one angle, you can much more clearly see that what it is like to people, although they are headless for inexplicable reasons, like ones that I haven't had explained to me anyway. But then from a different angle, it just looks like hands holding either like a giant turd or the piece of male anatomy. Like depending on what angle you're looking at it dramatically, and it was like $9 million or something. And so like it was like, I didn't mean to get distracted, but I just couldn't help to think about it. And
No, but that's fair, and it's timely.
Yeah. Like it I think it is kind of symbolic in the sense of representing the empty symbolism of embracing King's legacy versus actually materially making the changes in people's lives that King's dreams were about.
Yeah, definitely. That's fair. And I like I said, I haven't been following the controversy of just seeing things kind of flash by me. And I hadn't seen it at those weird angles, but I guess that was intentional, right? Like they probably didn't want to stick it in the headlines if it looks indecent or something.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want it as the feature picture, I should say, not the headline, but the featured image. But just one real quick thing, like in terms of theory, like when there was a book that I read, called Terms of Inclusion. It's about Black Brazilian like intellectual stuff. Intellectual stuff. That sounds really flat. What I mean to say is like Black Brazilian intellectuals and thought. There's a better way to put it. And at one point she talks about this statue that's made, that's supposed to be in honor of like Black people and specifically Black women. And in it, there's like a really interesting footnote where she talks about how, like historically speaking, and just like thinking about the way memorialism and stuff like that works, or memorializing and the way it works, it often operates as a way to like kind of silence and forget the figures that are supposed to be honored, right? So it's like ironic because you would think to yourself, okay, like they're creating a memorial in honor of this person or this group of people, right? But at the end of the day, and like oh my gosh, Ana Araújo has also talked quite frequently about this, she's a Brazilianist scholar, and she writes about slavery and things like that. But basically what ends up happening is like the person that's being memorialized, the memorial itself becomes indicative of like the symbol, and that's the end all be all of that person. So it ends up becoming important if and only when the society or like the people at the top have decided that they're not going to talk about that thing anymore, right? And so you see this even when you think about like COVID or like other memorials that are done, people who have died in wars and all this stuff. It's done basically as kind of like, well, this is it. This is all you get. Like we're gonna spend your money on creating this thing, and then this image in place of actually talking about the sort of real impact of the thing or person that's being memorialized, right? And it's ironically, despite it being a physical symbol of remembering, it ends up being a signal to the public to forget and to basically see that activity or that person or, you know, that moment in history as something that is settled. So yeah, basically, like, as you're memorializing that thing, the society or the government is signaling to the public that it's done, it's over with, it's closed, it's resolved, and there's no need to do anything beyond just remember the object, like to see, or not even to remember, but to see the object as a symbol for that thing or person or movement. And that's it, if that makes sense. I hope I made sense here, but they're
No,
not necessarily
absolutely.
always good. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think it clues us in a bit to perhaps some of the motivation or the reasoning or whatever behind not having the heads or faces on the statue or on the statue,
Absolutely.
like,
Yep.
because it continues to water down MLK to just love people and love somebody else. Like, it's like there's a loving embrace between him and his wife, and it's like on the tail, like there's a story behind it that means something. But to anybody that just sees the statue, if they don't have like a static image memory of that image, and even then that might be a stretch, and or read the plaque, they're gonna have no idea, other than maybe if they get it from the angle where it actually looks like an embrace. Oh, hugging is important. Okay, that's the takeaway. And so, like, I think that that statue is, and your description line up incredibly well. I did want to get back onto AI just for a moment,
Oh,
just
sure.
to touch,
Yeah.
like the algorithms, people know it heavily influences what they see on their social media, on YouTube or whatever. But there's also it's also happening behind the scenes or in front of the scenes, whatever, regarding inmates and people that are being adjudicated on. And so, like, one of the things that they're using AI for, one, they're not legally supposed to be doing it, is actually for sentencing. So they'll plug in the defendant's data into the algorithm, and the algorithm will tell them what the probability or likelihood of reoffending or whatever, and then they'll make a decision based on that. Now, they're not supposed to be making sentencing judgments based on that, but
Right.
it clearly is. And then they actually are, in some cases, making specifically parole decisions and those types of release decisions based around an AI algorithm. And so the point that you were raising earlier about that these systems get it wrong also coincides with something else that I've been noticing recently. It's just people's willingness or like necessity in order to survive or keep a job so they can survive, of just doing whatever the system, the computer, the boss just says. Like, that's the rule, this is what I have to
Mhm.
do. And so it's like, if we have algorithms that are telling us in increasingly parts of our life saying this is the situation and this is the appropriate response, I don't think we've, particularly in the US as a population, are prepared for the kind of critical thinking and introspection and like observation required to make sure that we're not just blindly following something that's telling us to do things that we don't even actually want.
And that's like how we're trained through life, right? Like, if you think about school, I mean, the way school operates now is pretty much just to memorize and to regurgitate whatever you see. And half the data, or, you know, when I say data, I mean like information that you get is inaccurate. People are working with old books, or teachers who are not properly informed, or schools that are not properly informed, or that are deeply conservative, or whatever, fill in the blank, you know, they have. But I think we're being taught, like, from the beginning, you know, you sit in your chair and you learn. I mean, you and I talked about this with Freire too, right? When we read Freire, and he mentions that as well. How the way we are taught to learn is often, it doesn't apply to real life. It's not flexible. It doesn't have us engaging in a real way, or thinking with any depth, you know, and having critical thinking involved. And I think that just translates into the workforce, right? And especially now, like, considering that people are so dependent upon labor, if they can keep it, you know, if you can keep a job, if amid all the health issues that people are having because of COVID and other long-term issues, because they haven't had access to healthcare because they couldn't afford it, you know, so you do whatever you can to keep on to the job keep on the job that you have, even if it's something that's harming you. And like, when I say harming you, I mean like blatantly harming you, right? Like, right now people are going into workplaces that are biohazards in ways that we've never quite had, except I guess during the previous pandemics, you know. So it's wild to me that like we're meant to just accept these things. And then I guess so that the question becomes, what's the alternative, right? Like we have unions, but the unions are busy, rolling over for whatever government is in power. They don't really push back against many governments, and when they do, they get crushed pretty quickly. So it can be really. I guess I empathize and understand why people sometimes are just they're going along with it, and it's unfortunate, like you said, that it's all now or a lot of it's being kind of rolled into this machine learning or AI systems that don't have any flexibility or that it don't allow for any real challenges. I did have a question too, I'm going back, it's my fault. I'm like all over the place, but
No worries.
I was curious because when you talked about the MLK statue, I started also thinking about that like weird Biggie Smalls statue in Brooklyn, which I don't know if you've seen, but it was done by a Black artist, actually. I don't know much about him, but it's in like, gentrified Brooklyn. And you ask yourself certain questions about like, who listens, like the people in that area who live there now, who are like predominantly white and wealthy or like upper middle class, when they listen to Biggie Smalls, it's like for fun or for a party or whatever. But like people who are growing up in Bed-Stuy or like in the local in the area, because I don't think the statue is actually in Bed-Stuy, but people who are growing up in that general area and vicinity, like who lived through the time that he was rapping and who were like his peers, are all being like priced out of their homes or forced out of New York altogether. And then now there's a memorial to him where they once were. You know what I'm saying? And this is it comes up a lot too with like Indigenous remembrance and stuff as well, where like it's like a thing that would happen quite a bit in some Latin American countries, because they had a whole movement that was like basically white Europeans kind of like pretending to be Indigenous, or people who were mestizo, who had like one great grandparent who was Indigenous, and then they like build their whole personality around being Indigenous when they weren't. Like that person really wasn't an Indigenous person. It was the person, for all intents and purposes, was living life and had lived life for generations as a European and had the benefits that came with that. And so, long story short, like these people were, like creating statues and having like all these shows and performances and things like that were like supposed to be in honor of like their Indigenous heritage, but then at the same time, advocating for the removal of Indigenous people and further marginalization of Indigenous people from their land and things like that, and like it disempowering them, and so in some ways, I guess my question too about the MLK statue is like, where is it located and what is the background of the artist? Because I sometimes wonder with like the Biggie Smalls statue, is that artist also trying to actually make the point that I'm making, or does it matter because is the long-term effect like the same thing that I'm talking about? Or is the artist, like, does the artist's perspective in this case matter? Or does their background matter if the subsequent effects are the opposite? And I guess then that does still connect back to AI though, because like AI, when intended to do one thing, doesn't really matter what the motivations or the intentions are of the creator of these systems, because at the end of the day, it ends up doing like the opposite of what the system may have been created to fight against, right? Like bias or whatever. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, if you happen to know any additional information on this.
Don't have too much on the Biggie statue.
No, not that one. I'm sorry. The MLK
yeah,
statue,
the MLK.
MLK monument. Yeah.
I mean, as far as I'm sorry, like I'm not sure the question regarding the MLK. Sorry, just so I make sure I answered the question.
Oh, no worries, because I was rambly. Went into this whole thing. What I mean is like, so I guess the questions are, to be clear, is who is the artist for the MLK statue, or like what's their background? Like, are they
Gotcha.
a person of color? Are they Black? Are they white, mixed, whatever? Like, how do they identify? And then also, what kind of neighborhood is it in? Because if I recall correctly, it's in like a kind of like a touristy, normal, like like just a normal touristy area, but I could be wrong. So, because as I said, I was like missing a lot of the information, even though I kept seeing it like flashing across my screen, but I hadn't had a chance to really read into it yet.
I myself also haven't gotten too far into it. I just like it just sprung to my mind because of the perspective aspect of it, and the that unfortunate aspect of how it came off to people that were standing at the wrong angle, essentially. As far as the too deep into the actual statue, I have very limited. I would be remiss to say that I could articulate further on that.
All right. So what I'm gonna do, I never do this because I'm a professional. But I am going to, this is all being said in tongue-in-cheek sorts of ways, by the way, for anyone who may be unclear. I'm making fun of myself. I do have generally a policy where I'm like not on my phone or my computer while we're having these conversations. But now I am curious because I think we should know these things. But then again, like I said, does it matter, right? Like if the final results generates this kind of conversation where we're asking what the heck is the intention of this artist, and is he or she or they modeling, like trying to water down MLK's history with this? Is that the message, right? Then that in and of itself is the problem, right? It's not so much what the artist's intention was as it is the effect, right? Like the final or the multiple results that there are. Okay, so this is in Philadelphia, right? If I'm not mistaken. Let me see. Okay, y'all literally hear me looking this up on my phone. This is like a left POC history happening right now. Okay, so is it in Phil? It's like, okay, Google is garbage right now. I can't believe this. It's not even looking like, okay, y'all, I'm serious. I put in MLK Memorial Philadelphia and it's pulling up all this stuff about like the memorial in DC because Google is broken.
It says Boston is what I'm.
Boston. Okay, Boston, Philadelphia, same thing. Yeah. And now everyone who subscribes to this podcast who is from Boston or Philadelphia has decided no longer to subscribe. Sorry, we'll miss you guys.
A lot of people getting very angry and very thick accents. Either Philadelphia or Boston.
Oh, we are about to get canceled. Okay. No, yeah. But you know, the good thing is like at least we're not being racist. We're just anti-Boston. Like I think that's a lot of people. I think there are people in Boston who are anti-Boston, so it's all right. So that adds another layer to it because like when I think about Boston, I immediately think of racism. So
yeah,
I think about racism and I think about like the American quote unquote American Revolution and like I'm sorry, Bostonites. Or Bostonians. See, I don't even know what they're called. This is how bad it is. I'm like Bostonites, Bostonians. My bad, you guys. I'm so sorry.
The eastern half of the United States. I've been there since I was a young, like toddler child. So.
All right. So let me see. I'm going to look on the Today Show page because I know that's going to be like super poppy and like mainstream, right? So they're not going to get too deep into it, but they probably will tell us the name of the oh no, that's just a video. I need to find out the name in the background of this person who made this sculpture. Okay, Washington Post. Let's try that one. If there's not a paywall. Yep, there's a paywall. Oh my goodness, guys. I think it's a sign that I don't need to learn any more about this. All right, let me see. I'm going to try one more website. Okay, NBC News, because I know they don't have a paywall. So let's see. It says here that, okay, the person who did it is named Hank Willis Thompson. He's a conceptual artist, and his piece was chosen out of about 125 artists and architects, or his application was chosen among all these people to do this. And then, okay, let me see.
I can imagine it's also particularly tough for a lot of artists like that are just out there trying to make a living,
right.
That you get presented with something like this, a commission work for something that could be career establishing or making or whatever. And even if you like, you like making that battle, you know, is like, do I create something that is likely to be selected so that I can get paid so that I can continue to work and live and so on and so forth, or do I do what I think would be the most the best possible option or whatever,
Mhm.
and even if I know it'll never get made because of that choice,
Right.
and then I won't get paid, and then I got to worry about how I'm going to put food on the table next week. And so like
Right.
and we all like have to struggle with these. Very few people, I think, and that I'm aware of, are able to find work where they don't feel like going to work is helping to move the capitalist machine along.
Right. Like he has, and yeah, it puts them in weird positions. They have to survive, as you said, but then also like it's also sad because you may actually have, as it seems with a lot of his art, including this one, like a really deep meaning behind it, but you can't piss off too many people. You can't be too controversial. But then even if you are being like, you know what I'm saying? Even if you are being controversial, people may misinterpret your intent.
Exactly. Yep.
And it seems like he, as I said, as I'm reading this, he has a background where he's done a lot of stuff about race and racism. It seems he did a statue about South African miners. He did a statue about it says unity in downtown Brooklyn, where an athlete is pointing up towards the sky. So okay, so all right, I'm gonna literally read again. This is Left POC history. I've never done this before in any episode, so you guys are hearing it first. This is from an NBC News article about this Boston. Yes, I'm still making fun of Boston statue. Okay, it says here the sculpture, quote, the sculpture sits in the same spot where in 1965, King led 20,000 people in the Northeast first march of the civil rights era to protest segregation in schools. All right, this is all about Martin Luther King. Where's the info about the artist? Okay, there's stuff about previous sculptures. Okay, here we go. He says that taking in the sculpture, the artist said, is meant to be interactive as visitors can walk inside it, and quote, be in the heart of their embrace. Like all of this is really beautiful, you know. It's a shame that the execution was kind of not what, and it makes you wonder too, like, did he look at it in these different angles? Did he not see that it, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's hard to be critical of your own art sometimes, right? Although some of us are overly critical of our art, or whatever we're producing. I'm just, yeah, I have lots of questions. I have a lot of questions. And while you're, let me see, I'm going to try one more thing. I just want to see if I can get any info about him, because there's nothing in this whole article that's about him and like his history. Like, how does he connect personally to this, if at all? Hank Willis Thomas, sorry, now I'm messing up his name too. Everyone in Boston, everyone in Philadelphia, and Hank Willis Thomas is going to be mad at me. So that's unfortunate. Okay, so it says here that he was born in 1976 in New Jersey to Hank Thomas, a jazz musician, and Deborah Willis, an artist, photographer, curator, and educator. He went to Duke Ellington School of the Arts and is a museum studies student. Again, I don't, let's see. And like now people who probably know this guy personally are gonna like be mad at me. Okay, he has 2 screen prints in 2013 that express the erasure of past injustices to the Black male body by printing photographs of humiliations or executions of Black men on retroreflective vinyl, which is commonly used for street signs, and rendering them invisible except under flash photography. Oh, that's fucking cool. You know what I'm saying? These sorts of, like, when you read about the work that he did, it sounds amazing. He's done a lot of stuff criticizing police brutality and violence, in particular against Black people and Black men. I mean,
I guess he's also behind the giant Afro pick in Philadelphia. So
is he?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, so just again, me taking a guess, I'm assuming that he's Black. or
Yeah,
biracial.
that's I thought I saw a picture, but now I realize
Now
I
I
didn't.
can't even find a picture of this dude. It's like a mystery. Everything's a mystery about Mr. Hank here. But I would assume, I mean, again, I'm just connecting some dots here. Now maybe I could be wrong. I'm more than happy to, I'm willing to be wrong here, but based on all the context clues, if someone said, guess this person's racial background, and again, not that race is super relevant here, but I'm just curious. And I think that from what I've read, yeah, he's a black guy. And from what I've
Yep.
read about his work, he seems like really with it. I definitely don't think that when he created this art, that his intent was for it to erase the significance of King's impact, right?
Hmm.
But it's unfortunate that it seems like that's been the way it's getting interpreted in some instances, because from what I see about his background and what he has done art wise, it seems like it's not at all what he's going for. I don't know. I'm sorry to have taken this as deep as I have, but I was really wondering, like, I'm curious, like what's going on here? Um, and his wife is also in art. She's a curator, it says, at the Whitney. She's from Zimbabwe.
No, I
Um,
think it also, I think one of the points that you raised that's also important that ties also back to the AI aspect of it is just that, like, when you with art, once you make it, you have your interpretation of what you're creating, but then it goes out into the world and
right.
other people are free to interpret it and interact with it, and that doesn't always reflect what you intended, and that's just the nature of art. And with AI, one of the things, like, I've been listening to several different AI developers and like what they're talking about, and the common term that they use is called the alignment problem, which is that your AI, whether your AI is doing what you wanted it to do, and like there's several layers to that problem, but one of the things that they say is that, like, if we create an AGI, which is like the advanced form of AI, or essentially if we're able to pawn off our decision making to AI, we have to make sure that we design it to do what we want. Otherwise, because the
Mm-hmm.
AI is going to do what it's designed to do,
Right.
and the problem is that we can't articulate what we want. So the AI, like, uh, it would be as if the artist created the statue without being to articulate what they intended to be able to for people to be able to pull away from it at all in the first place. So it leaves
Yeah.
it even more wildly open to interpretation, and uh, leaves you in a situation in AI's case where if you've handed over the decision making process to this AI thing and it's making decisions based off of the mistaken notions of what we desire or what we need or will continue our survival and thriving. I if we mess that up, there is no going back and fixing it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's too late. Like that will be how things end. Like, you won't be able to go back into the machine and fix it. There's a book from the early 1900s that I think people would be interested in, called "The Machine Stops," and it's less than 100 pages, I think. So it's not too tough of a read, but it very uh I don't know, it does a good job of kind of predicting a lot of the situations that we find ourselves in. Sometimes it's almost like identical to what's happening, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's more of an artistic interpretation. And again, it was early 1900s, so
Right.
this is before computer technology, but it was really much of anything. But they basically incorporate that into this future, and I won't spoil it, but like it it captures this problem in an artistic way that I think people will find fascinating and interesting to read. So I just thought of that, so I thought I'd mention it.
Yeah, I've heard of this book before and I've never read it, but I've definitely heard it's like very, very good and apt for our current times. And yeah, I agree with you. And I think I even mentioned like that there's that interpretation problem and that's parallel to AI. But I agree too that the finality of it all, right, is what makes it kind of scary. And the inability to correct on the outside. I think there's some AI that's supposed to be able to like self-correct. Depending on what it is. But again, like things that are that are being used in law, quote unquote, law enforcement and policing, it'll be too late to self-correct. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're not just talking about a thing that's going to like make some fake paintings. We're talking about life or death decision making, that's going
And
to
it's
be left
already
up to a
happening to a
machine.
degree.
Right.
Like
Oh
it's so
yeah.
like
Yeah.
in like so like that's the thing is like it's people think of AI as like this far off thing. It's like it's in your pocket. It's how your
Right.
photo. It's how you're when you're taking a picture. It's how it
Hmm.
focuses. It's how it finds faces, and those are all different layers of machine learning and AI that are all happening constantly. Like, and
Right.
your GPS is using AI to help better give you directions and so forth. Like it's already all over the place, and we've integrated it into our lives without even thinking about it. And one of the things that comes to my mind is there's an episode of The Office where it was the early days of GPS, and Michael Scott's following the GPS, and it leads him to drive into a lake. And it's like that's where we're heading, is like if people don't like if we're not far more conscious, because even the most ethical scientists in the AI field, when I listen to them, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, because of how seemingly powerless they are to actually address it, and yet they're still just moving forward with the technology without having any sort of real solution for the core problem of the alignment
And what
issue.
does that remind you of? Because it certainly reminds me of another science-related problem that we're dealing with right now, which is COVID. No one like the people who are in charge don't seem to have a clue what to do. I mean, there are things that they can do that could help, but like a lot of people really don't, to be honest, don't know what's going on and don't seem to care about coming up with solutions, and instead are just trying to find ways to like satiate capital as long as they can until I guess we all die. Like, I don't know what the end game is.
Yeah, I mentioned
Um,
it in our pre-conversation about like it boils down to is like a reasonable and rational response to COVID and capitalism are just not compatible. They're mutually
mhm.
exclusive. You're going to have one or the other, and like obviously, the U.S. capitalist hegemony is going to choose capitalism
That's
and
right.
enforce that on the rest of the world, and so like we're seeing the most ethical scientists among us try to navigate this space, but they're being demolished at every turn.
And drowned out by people who are willing to take a buck over human lives, who are like pushing out misinfo or, lying about the data that we do have and trying to minimize the effects, or not the effects, but like minimize the impact, at least in a rhetorical sense, that it will have on the general population, to actually encourage them to take steps to further protect themselves or their children or whatever, and instead to just like lull people into denial, indifference to death, and mass death on top of that, right? Yeah, and I just think I've talked about this at length elsewhere and in articles, in my tweets and stuff, so like everyone knows where I stand on this, but I just think it's really mind-blowing that there hasn't been more of an effort made by the left, like as loosely as you want to define that, whether you mean Democrats, which I don't, but let's include Democrats for a moment in that. Anyone who's not a Republican, it's shocking to see that there has not been more of an effort made by those with power, in a formal sense, and especially by those without formal power, but who identify as leftists, to really push for more change, or to even enact protocols and things to keep each other safe in their own personal lives. Like, it's wild to me that people who are disabled or who are high risk or who have kids, or like literally like any COVID infection can make you high risk. So let's just say everybody, because I don't want to make this about a disabled versus non-disabled thing. Like, anyone can be disabled by way of COVID infection, or be
Only
dealing with
minority group
chronic
you can
disease.
only minority group anybody can join at any time.
Yeah, it's like quite literally. Yeah. And so it's really something to see people in so-called leftist spaces, so-called radical spaces, going on trips with no mask and having rallies with no mask and having indoor meetings and activities that are explicitly segregationist, in the sense that it excludes anyone who's trying not to get COVID, like, because again, I know that there's an element, it's a clear element that's ableist as well, that is exclusionary to people who are disabled, who have chronic illness and the like. That's obvious. But I think the less obvious and less discussed, is the way that it excludes any and everyone who is, regardless of their ability level, and health. if they want to not get this virus, or get it again or again, fill in the blank. I know people who have been reinfected multiple times and they're still doing their very best to avoid it, but they can't because of their workplace or because of the circumstances that they're in, where they need family or schools or whatever to help with children that they have. Like, this country and many other countries, but especially the United States, is putting people in impossible situations, that to the point where they can't avoid infection no matter what they do. And they're not offering any support, whether it's material in terms of keeping people home and paying them to stay home, or if it's support in terms of masking, testing, fill in the blank. Like, instead of, I say fill in the blank a lot, but I apologize. It's a tick I apparently have, like a repeat language sort of thing. But it's so frustrating, and it's clearly a labor issue. And I don't think there's just such mass delusion that the left doesn't want to address it. And it's horrifying and terrifying. And it's like, okay, well, if you guys aren't willing to do the very freaking bare bones, basic ass thing to put on a mask and require masks at your meetings or your rallies, or like have a flippant air purifier in the corner, I don't know, do a virtual meeting instead of an in-person meeting, or have a hybrid meeting, which is very easy to do. If you're not willing to do that, which is like so easy, then how are you, like, I know you're not going to have my back when the real shit breaks out. And technically the pandemic is the real shit, like, I'm not trying to downplay the pandemic, but like, much like when, the best way I think about this is like, you have these like hardcore preppers on the Republican end, and they're like, okay, like when the government tries to take over, take our rights and take our guns, we're going to be armed to the teeth and we're going to be ready and this and that. And then like, those people didn't want to wear masks when the pandemic hit. So it was like a real like apocalyptic event. And they were like screaming about how masks are not working and whatever. So like the way those people dropped their ball when it came down to an actual government is not doing their jobs, and they're letting people die, and they're forcing a disease onto people, and they're not like, they're actually oppressing people, right? Like in a way that you think would be a trigger for someone who's a prepper like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like real zombie time now. And if they don't know how to respond. So like for the left, for me, I saw it as a parallel, because it's like, you see this moment where capital is just taking full advantage of people. They're forcing them back to work while they're sick. They're forcing parents back to work when they have children at home that cannot be in school because schools are deeply unsafe, and they're forcing teachers back into unsafe work environments. And like, it's like literally something that a historic left figure would have used as an example in his or her book of like capitalist overreach, right? Like the examples are right there in your face. The government refuses to pay for PPE. The government is privatizing all the health response to COVID now. The government is defunding hospitals. Nurses are on strike left and right because they're not being given adequate pay or adequate time, and they're being forced to go to work sick. Like, what's it like? This is it, guys. You know what I mean? Like, this is the moment. This is the time. Like, this is where you need to be organizing and making gains and like pushing back and screaming till your lungs pop about this happen, like what's happening right now. And no, it's as if it's just being met with radio silence. And I feel like, once Biden became president, whether they were liberals or leftists, or like, when I say leftist, like I'm talking about the farthest reaches of communism you could possibly imagine, all these MFers went back to brunch. Everybody went back to brunch. And this is a moment where you cannot be at freaking brunch. You need to be doing something. And so it's been really eye-opening to me for all this talk about how we're anti-government and anti-imperialism and anti-this and anti-that, and we're abolitionists and we believe in equal rights and blah, blah, blah. And then you're holding these indoor events where nobody's wearing a mask, and poor people who are dying disproportionately of COVID are catching COVID from your little events where you're talking about how much you care about the working class. Like, give me a fucking break. And I'm sorry for my language, folks, but I'm really like, I'm done. I'm tired of this, seeing all the hypocrisy. And it's not right. But anyway, this is the time. And it also reminds me too of like, I remember when like Black Lives Matter stuff was really popping off. And like now we can have a separate discussion about issues with Black Lives Matter as a movement. But in general terms, when you're looking at like the Ferguson revolts and like the stuff that was going down in Baltimore and all of that. And then Black people, for the most part, especially young Black people in this country, we were like, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, we need to do something. We need to send our support. We need to go to these rallies. We need to do this. We need to do that. And then it was like white friends of ours it was like crickets. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're like, why aren't they saying anything about this? They're like, they're not tweeting anything. They're not like talking about it amongst us. They're not reading any art. Like, it was like we were all in separate worlds, And I think now with COVID, I'm getting that same kind of vibe where it's like, a lot of disabled people and chronically ill people have been screaming at the top of their lungs, which they've been doing forever, but like especially now with COVID, saying like, please stop causing this pandemic to get worse. Like, stop it. Like CDC, do your jobs. Government, do your jobs. Like everyday people in our lives, please wear a mask. Like, please test before you. Like, so many things that can be done and that people are choosing not to do. And it feels like, again, we're living in separate worlds. And in this case, quite literally, people are, because there are people who can't even, like you can't even go to the hospital or go to the doctor's office safely anymore because of COVID and the way it's been let to run loose, Like if you have a chronic illness, you can't.
I was just going to say, thankfully, it's one of the few places where they still require masking, at least locally for me.
Yeah. Well, you're lucky then, because in a lot of places, they either have dropped masks or they don't enforce it. So that's like one of the problems I've seen whenever I go to the hospital. Because like the doctors, like the hospital that I go to has a lot of my doctors in it because it's like within walking distance of my house. Okay. So I go to this doctor's, I go like a lot of my doctor's offices are inside of a hospital, if that makes sense. My daughter's pediatrician is inside of a hospital. So I have to go inside of a hospital and I will sit in a pediatrics office in a hospital and the receptionist doesn't have her mask on. The patient's parents sometimes have their masks around their nose, under their chin, whatever else. It's like they're little kids in here, like some of whom are too young to even wear a mask. They're like 6 months old and y'all are not wearing masks, and people don't care. They don't, because they've been lied to and told that little kids don't get COVID, or if they get COVID, it's not that bad. None of which is true. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't know what the long-term effects are. And yet people are acting like that's fine, and we're looking at potential mass, like we're talking about like definitely a mass disabling event, but potentially a mass extinction event. Like, I'm sorry to laugh, but what the F, like, how are we not? I guess I'm just confused, like how people are not connecting these dots that are very, very clear about labor rights. And I'm seeing people lose their jobs because they're too disabled to work, or people lose their jobs because they refuse to go into an unsafe work environment. They're asked to work from home and they're being refused that right, despite they're already being disabled or chronically ill or having had kids or whatever. Like, we talk often about like maternity leave or paternity leave, right? Where people should have the right to be at home with their kid for a little bit. You just popped out a baby and like maybe you want to take care of it for a little bit, God forbid. And women or parents in general being forced back into work before they can even like meet their kid. And so I'm sitting here like, if we can understand that, why can't we understand that like being forced back to work after a critical illness is maybe not the best idea? Like, maybe you should be afforded the right to stay home for a little bit and recover and like get actual health care and like maybe see what's going on with you, instead of being forced back into work which was a decision literally based on a former Delta CEO, I don't know if he was even former, but definitely a Delta CEO. How can you see that as okay if you're a leftist, right? Like, am I missing something? Help me, please.
It's hard to say. One of the things that comes to my mind is I recently was watching Kwame Ture give a speech at university. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but one of the phrases that he said, and it turns out it was also the title of his posthumous autobiography, was "Ready for Revolution." And he's like, he said, "I'm ready for revolution." And I thought about it, and I was like, do I think I'm ready for revolution?
Nobody
And
is ready right
no,
now.
yes, that was the assessment that I arrived at. Is that no, I'm not ready, and no one is ready. Like you mentioned the uprisings around Black Lives Matter and such, and like that's one example. And we see, like in COVID, we've seen similar example in that people aren't ready for a revolutionary moment. So even if like
No.
tomorrow there was the ideal perfect revolutionary moment where suddenly there was this clarifying moment, like thing that happened that everybody saw, it was like we wouldn't know what to do with it. We just don't
No.
know what to do with it.
And I
And
see it. I'm seeing it. Like I don't have to wait until tomorrow. Like I'm seeing it right now. And I feel like everybody's just not everybody. I shouldn't say everybody because a lot of people are angry just like me. And we're all like doing our best to help other people or to plan or to help our family. You know, like I'm literally like I'm running out of ideas. I've done so much stuff. And like you at some point you have to say, okay, well, like, how do I put this? Like it's I guess I'm saying it's very isolating and scary because it feels like no one's ready and this is the moment. And now the hard part is articulating how to address this moment adequately so that you can turn something like a pandemic around. But at the same time, it's like even on a basic level, like worker protections, right? How did we get sick leave in the past? Like what's the point of having sick leave if no one's allowed to use it? You know what I'm saying? So like why do we have that as an option in most jobs and yet people don't feel the right to apply it to themselves? They cannot, like what's the point of having sick days if we can't take them, you know? And why is the government, and especially even why are unions not pushing for that? You know what I'm saying? Why are people not pushing for worker protections during a fucking global pandemic that's ongoing and killing thousands of people a week? Like what is happening? Like
and what seems
you know?
nonsensical is usually like the explanation, as much as it can be, is well they're seeking profit. But it's like
Yeah,
in this case they're not even effectively doing that. They're chasing profit by sacrificing people, but all they're getting is still a downing or a reduction in profit and sick and dying employees. And so
right.
like it's not effective. And I think part of it is because one of the aspects of it is uh, what's profitable for a 60-year-old CEO for the rest of his life may not be beneficial for society, for the society that a 20-year-old is going to grow old in, or
Hmm.
like ideally hopefully be able to grow old in. And so like their motives and their uh what's the word I'm looking for, incentives are very different. Like, and so like, and that's a fundamental problem of capitalism that is unreal, like that you can't resolve with regulations and rules. Like
Hmm.
it's just a fundamental aspect of when society is so overwhelmingly controlled by people with power and money, and to get that power and money takes time. You're going to end up with a society that is overly tilted towards caring for a very small subset of
Hmm.
people. And you're talking about wealthy elderly people, because obviously we don't care for poor elderly people, and we don't care for like tons of people. Like,
Yeah.
we don't even care for the people that we send to fight imperialist wars and come back damaged. We don't even take care of them.
No. And as I said, like evolutionarily speaking, I used to think like, okay, well, uh all right, we're going to protect ourselves, right? Like on a basic level, you think, okay, protect self, protect family, right? And often people say things like, well, I want my kids to have a better life than I had or whatever, and like I'm a mama bear and this and that, blah blah, like it's all BS when it comes to COVID. But it's weird to me, right? Because it seems what I see people doing right now, and like the fact that so many people are just not fighting at all, like the supposed people who are radicals are like whatever about this, it seems. But then also even the rich people who are whatever about this, it's weird to me. Like I don't understand, like maybe because I'm a new mom or something, but like I feel like my literal job is to protect my child. Like that's my job. I will be run ragged and tired and like, I haven't eaten in like however many hours, starving to death, and I'm over there making my child's food, right? Like this is how you think as a parent. If you love your child, usually you're like self-sacrificial in a lot of ways. And that's not to say that that's exactly healthy, but generally speaking, we put our children first. And what I'm seeing right now is like a lot of incredibly selfish and like harmful treatment of children, and of elderly people and of people that we supposedly pretend to care about, um, even if it's our own, which is like so weird to me because it seems like against like basic evolutionary principles. And I understand what you're saying with regard to like like elderly rich people are protecting themselves, I guess, but like not even. Like you look at Congress, you look at the Senate, and like those are all old rich people. Like a lot of them are old rich people. They're not masking anywhere. Like maybe they have something we don't know about. That's what I keep thinking. Like maybe they just have some sort of medication or something we don't know about. They definitely had access to Paxlovid earlier than the rest of the population, for example. But I'm just like, there's not a cure for this yet, to the best of my knowledge. So like, what are y'all doing? How are they doing this? And still alive and like not falling down from exhaustion or fatigue or whatever else all the time. Like, how are we not seeing people just like die of heart attacks on the Senate floor, knowing what we know about COVID? It's kind of strange, but I just find,
The
find
best
that,
explanation,
yeah.
or
No,
I
I'm
was going to
sorry,
say
go ahead.
best explanation I could come up with is just that uh, you're falling into old patterns of how to recapture what they feel they're losing, and to a degree they are, some of them anyway. Because some people like Bezos and a handful of others have gotten extraordinary, even more wealthy over the time period, and some of that has gone away, as we saw with Elon Musk and Tesla,
Right.
where billions of
And Twitter.
dollars are captured and then lost, and like so like it's a bizarre thing that a fortune that a million people would struggle to spend over like over a decade is like just gained and lost by a single person over a bad month or two. Like that's
That's
just,
right.
it's wild. And then all the other scandals and schemes that we got going on, like the last year, like $1 trillion of wealth has been just evaporated. Essentially,
Mm-hmm.
all the wealth that millennials or like the millennials and Gen Z has created, a great swath of it just disappeared basically overnight.
Right.
And it's wild. And so like to the point about the whether elderly rich powerful people are protecting themselves, just that like they're in the old habits of if I want my business to make more money, I got to make sure my employees are showing up to work. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
even though that puts them in more danger than having, and costs them and is less effective for generating profit than just having a system that utilizes work from home in an effective way for their industry. Like
Right.
they'd rather stick with the ways that they're used to and that have worked in the past than do what even makes sense from a capitalist perspective today. Like so they're not even able to make those types of adjustments. That's the best I've come up with for an explanation, besides the idea that they just have something we don't have access to.
Right. Like in for me, I just immediately started thinking of Waterfalls by TLC. Like, don't go chasing waterfalls. What is it? Stick to the rivers and the lakes that you used to. I know that you're gonna have it your way or nothing at all. See, it applies. um yes, the theme for today is utter silliness because the world is ending and I'm just trying to cope through dad humor, I guess. But yeah, I actually I do sing well. That was like my joke singing voice. So I apologize to everyone I just put through that and tortured with my joke rendition of Waterfalls. But yeah, I do think that, I think you're right. And I think that it reminds, some of what you said just now reminds me of something too that William Richardson said. And shout out to William Richardson. Some of you might remember we spoke to him like many years ago about his work on colonialism and stuff. So I'll include his discussion that we had that may be worth revisiting in the show notes. But he mentioned, we were talking and he was just like, at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff, when it comes to the pandemic, like many of us are trying to figure out what the end game is, right? We're like what is happening? Like, do they have something that we don't, or is it like a depopulation effort, or like what's happening? Or like, why is no one doing anything? A lot of us are asking that question. And to that, he said, ultimately, we often assign a level of intelligence to wealthy people because just culturally we've been taught that to get rich, you have to be smart, right? And he was like, you know what? At the end of the day, these people are not smart. And, we have to remind ourselves of that. And he brought up like Elon Musk and his losing all that money and stuff. And he was just like, just because they're rich doesn't mean they're smart, doesn't mean they have a plan, doesn't even on the nefarious end, right? Like, we know that they're benefiting from very negative behaviors and things like that, and things that are hurting us and harmful. But at the end of the day, they don't always have a clearly outlined plan. And it also makes me think about, what you and I had spoke about when we read Colonizer and the Colonized. Like, you can go listen to those episodes as well. I'll put those in the show notes also. But one of the things that Memi talks about is the fact that, like, a lot of the colonizers, despite presenting themselves as kind of the know-it-alls and the absolute intellectuals of this whole operation, are failures. A lot of these people are people who couldn't make it in their homelands, and so they went abroad trying to like do stuff somewhere else and try to reinvent themselves, but they don't know what they're doing half the time, and then they're the ones who are put in charge.
And I'm not a loser at this new school. It's like, no,
right.
The problem, like, you were the problem.
Exactly. And that's why it used to make me nuts when people would, like, they didn't want to call Donald Trump a fascist because they were like, oh, he's too stupid to be a fascist. And I'm like, what does that mean? Do you think that, like, did you think that Hitler was like a Nobel, not Nobel Prize winner, obviously, but like you think he's like an Oxford like scholar or something? Like, what do you think? Do you think that fascism has to have some sort of high intellectual component? Is that what you think? Is that the only way to define fascism? Like, how many fascist movements do you know that were done by, like astrophysicists or something? Like, no, it's about a feeling, and it's about a feeling of hatred and ideology that's combined with capital. And at the end of the day, a lot of what we're seeing, and I think it is, I think it's just like kind of the icing on the cake for the already pre-existing fascism in this country and around the world that's growing. But to look at the pandemic as anything other than just like an element of that is a mistake, I think. And I agree with William, because I think part of myself, like part of my thinking, I was also trying to kind of fit intentionality in where perhaps there isn't any, because I'm also still working through like old ideas, and that are like conditioned ideas, not that I'm intentionally holding, but like ideas about, oh, people in power have gotten there because they're smart, or people in power have gotten there because they're trained for it, or they're this kind of technocratic idea, right? Where they're the experts. And experts always have a plan, right? But what I'm realizing is like the experts don't have a flipping plan, and that's for the worst for all of us, right? Like I somewhat wish they did have a plan, even if it were bad, because then we could fight against it more clearly, easily. But right now we're just fighting fog, and it's very confusing, and I think that's what's scary. Going back to what we were talking about, I think that's why people aren't ready, because it's like an uncertain enemy. You know what I'm saying? The enemy is ourselves, which is also scary, and I don't think people want to address. But like, if you're walking around without a mask and you know that you can get COVID and spread COVID if you're not masking, you are technically my enemy. But you're not my only enemy, right? Like, I understand the larger institutional enemy as well. I'm not saying that like everybody walking around a mask is like Darth Vader or something, although he does wear a mask. But my point is, I wish everyone were like Darth Vader. But my point is that like, I think that there's a kind of trickle down, like a trickling down of the enemy, right? And we're being taught to fight one another. And in that fog of fighting one another, we're not able to cohesively come up with a plan to fight the much bigger problem that's like a top-down issue. And we don't have the tools to like combat this. Like, how do you combat the CDC, right? How do you combat the federal government's poor COVID response? How do you fight for better sick pay or sick days when you're all sick, right? How does that work? Like, how do we do that? And I think in that confusion and in those moments of uncertainty, that makes people less able and it properly equipped to come together and actually do something. It's like it kind of paralyzes us in that way. And I think people are I think people are like, again, like they're just in the fog. And that's what's scary to me, because it's it's not having a defined enough enemy that makes people more susceptible to indifference and denial. And so what scares me is that, like, as fascism like ramps up more and more and more, and now it does have this eugenics component by way of the pandemic, what are we doing about it? And the answer is jack shit. So I don't know.
It is demoralizing to see that in the face of all of this, that the left has had, like, I feel like, I don't know, I don't want to give a specific peak or whatever, but I feel like things were definitely growing on the left through the Bernie Sanders first run through 2016. There was definitely like a lull after that, and then some sort of pickup in 2020. But 2020 Bernie run was demonstrably like different than 2016, because the main thing that appealed for Bernie to the people that either had politics to the left of him or just hadn't or wasn't like weren't on board with him already was his consistency and integrity, like his ability to say what he meant and to stick with it over time. And in the 4-year interim between those two runs, he had already what's the word I'm looking for? Just given in to Democrats on too many aspects to maintain that credibility, particularly with the people to his left. He probably still maintains most of that credibility with folks that like became leftists as a result of Bernie Sanders, or like, you know, like that was the left boundary of their politics was Bernie Sanders. He probably still has credibility with them, and is, even if not possibly even more endeared because of his willingness to compromise or whatever you want to call it with Democrats. But and like there was definitely a large spike following the murder of George Floyd, where it looked like, hey, this could actually be a moment, like this we could have some serious things, like some serious change could happen. And then that was co-opted and captured by the Democratic movement and crushed. And like it was, and we saw some streets get painted, some get renamed, some statues go up, and the cops are getting bigger paychecks to like make them like training is not the problem, man.
Right. Yeah,
like,
they don't need any more training.
There's an institutional, fundamental, systematic problem of how policing functions, period. Doesn't matter. You could have I almost said a bunch of priests, but that's probably not like, you can have the best people you can imagine, like being cops, and it's still going to have these same problems, because the problems aren't at the individual level, they're at the systemic and institutional level,
right?
And beyond that, at the fundamental level of how what capitalism needs in order to function. Like you just, like, as long as we're in a capitalist system, the police system is always going to be catastrophic. Like you can't have a good police system within the capitalist system. You have less detrimental ones, like you see in like social democracies in Northern Europe, but you're not going to actually have you just can't, like. And that's one of the things that I find so frustrating is, even, and I see this on the left as well, like meaning to the left of Democrats, of people that just don't want to let go of capitalism. They just can't let go. Like
it's an addiction, as you said.
It's an addiction. Like fix it, try to mitigate the damage it causes. Is like, even if that's your position, you have to at least first recognize that these problems are a result of the system at play. Like, and that within that system, you are not going to resolve those problems, period. Like, instead, they always just lean back onto, oh, well, those are human nature problems. It's like, that's bunk, outdated science. Like, that's
an inadequate response. Yeah.
That's phrenology. Like, that's not what the modern social science is saying, and not just the liberal communists. So, like, no, it's like, increasingly we're finding that scientists outside of the field of politics are arriving at a conclusion, and like it's weird when you read it because you can see them arriving at this conclusion that the core problem is capitalism itself, but realizing that they can't actually articulate that in their paper, or won't get published, or won't get cited, and so on and so forth. So they just dance around it. And,
Mhm.
and you see it and I've been noticing it increasingly in a variety of different sciences, where they're like, well, why is it like this? And then when they investigate, they're like, oh, it's because we have profit motive.
Right.
Like, it doesn't make sense in any other context, period, at all. Like the only way it can make sense is if you accept the propaganda of Adam Smith's capitalism, of in the concept of homo economicus, and people, the basically everybody being selfish, the invisible hand will mold that into being beneficial for everyone. It's like, if you don't
Mhm.
believe that, which has obviously been like, it's obviously garbage, but it's like, if you don't believe that, then like most of the things that are happening in this country just don't make sense.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I'm at a loss for words most of the time, just assessing things on my own. But certainly when I talk to other people, I've noticed that like a lot of us are reaching the same conclusions, like what you just laid out basically. And I think also like the way you outlined it is fair. And I agree in the sense that there, at least in the US, right, there has been a lull, there has been what seems like a standstill. And what I have noticed in particular is that a lot of people who were part of the Bernie movement, or like they kind of rose to prominence during the Bernie stuff in the US, have since become either hardcore liberals again, or like they're using leftism as a way to kind of sheepdog people to the right, which I know sounds doesn't make sense, but that's what I'm witnessing, right? So people who are talking about socialism, but they have a spin on it that kind of sounds a lot like not like raw socialism, but like something else. To me, it sounds more like fascism.
It's a very
And
clever rhetorical technique used by libertarians to like
yeah,
like, hey, I'm with you on these social issues, and by the way, did you know like
right.
capitalism rules?
Exactly. And there's also like a lot of, I feel like, is now that you mention it, like there's also a lot of libertarianism sneaking into things that I don't know, I wasn't necessarily expecting. Like I figured some people would just like either go farther left, like I did see a lot of that. Like I did see a lot of people who became like communists or socialists in like a regular socialism way, not in like a Bernie socialist way, like a light socialism, but actually became socialists. And I think I expected that. And then I expected some people to just like go back to liberalism because they felt like the Bernie stuff failed and they're not going to try again. But I wasn't expecting the fash stuff. And I think the reason that I wasn't expecting it to be as bad is because at the earlier stages of it, I knew that there were some grifters and I called them out. I was very transparent about that. But some people were like, I didn't exactly love, but I wasn't expecting them to go as far to the right as they did, or I didn't expect them to try to sneak in so much far right stuff over time. Like I as much as this is probably gonna get me in trouble, but like Bhaskar Sankara is one person that comes to mind. And I'm not saying he's a fascist, but he's definitely been an apologist for them. And he's definitely said some things where I was like, yo, that's not socialist at all. Like you just sound like you're like you're just like, and Jacobin in general has gone in some directions that I feel like have been really scary during the pandemic, and kind of seem to be signaling to the right and doing some dog whistle drops that make me deeply uncomfortable. And
still a desperation on the left to appeal to right wingers instead of just organizing the people that already agree with them.
Exactly. And not even that agree with them, but that are like politically indifferent or who are disenfranchised. Like that's the main thing. I mean, you should be working with poor people, period. Like,
yeah.
And not like the point shouldn't be, let's go get some right wingers on our side, because what they're doing to do that is not converting the right wingers. They're going and speaking their language to them and then trying to insert some stuff about socialism in it. And that's not how you convert people. You know what I'm saying? Like you can't, so you can't say like, look at those trans people, they're ruining schools and girls sports and all this stuff. But hey, you want some universal health care? Like that's not, that's not good, because trans people make up this movement. You know what I'm saying? Like trans people are disproportionately affected by poverty and are and just it like they are disproportionately poor because of the way the society operates, and yet you're going to throw them under the bus so you can go get some Nazis on your side. Like, do you hear yourself? So
Yeah,
that
and
kind of stuff
I
has
was just
been
gonna say for a minute.
dangerous.
I was
Hmm?
gonna say I was just gonna say that like and then when or sorry, I lost my train of thought. It'll come back to me momentarily.
Are you sure? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. No,
We were talking about like people on the left using fascist language to appeal to fascists, and then dropping, like trying to drop hints about socialism, but then throwing people who are marginalized and disenfranchised that they should be supporting under the bus.
oh yeah. Okay. Well, one the popularity of open fascism has been surprising. Like obviously, I felt like the U.S. already had the like fascism seething underneath it, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
overtly. But like it's been surprising just how popular just overt fascism has been. I guess it harkens back to when like 50% of Republicans said that they wanted to like kick all Muslims out of the country, essentially, like
Mm-hmm.
completely disregarding freedom of religion. But the other aspect was that, like you mentioned, the whole like, oh, trans people are ruining our schools, but don't you want free healthcare or you want healthcare,
Right.
right? And it's like, and when those people go to the bargaining table to hash out the details of this universal healthcare, guess what's on the cutting block?
Right.
Trans health rights. Like,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
so and it happens. It's happened every time. Like it happens over and over. Like that's one of the frustrating parts is that to the degree that they have this is operating under a plan, is that they use these same things over and over habitually, like even possibly and probably not even consciously sometimes
Mm-hmm.
to do this. Whether it's dividing and conquer or it's this. It's just it's so consistent and like it's very frustrating that we don't seem to have a formulaic or like a reliable response to it, and that to whatever degree that does exist, it's not nearly as popular as open fash.
Right. And yeah, and I don't, it is like you said, it's that cycle. Doing this over and over again is really exhausting. Not so exhausting that I'm ready to completely abandon leftism. Like that's not what I'm saying. Like I'm not interested in abandoning socialist principles or anything like that, because to me they're fundamental. But I think for some people it does get tiring to the point that they say, you know what, I'm just going to go back to my little, call to everybody, go out and vote, and that's it. And some of us just don't have time to do as much as we were doing in the past. And so then it becomes a matter also of just like how much effort and energy can you continue to exert, um, to only be crushed or to only be co-opted or to only be told that your issue doesn't matter because we got to go appeal to some right wingers, like it's, and Democrats do that too. I'm not just saying the leftist people do this, but like regular Democrats continue to do that as well. How many times have we seen them placate the right, so we don't really have any, at least at the institutional level, but even the, like I would say, kind of like a sub-institutional level, we don't really have any leadership, and we don't have any people that we can look to easily and say, like, that's the next person who's going to push for change. And I think that sort of vacuum that's been left for a lot of people has meant, going in a direction where they know they can make money, right? I think that's
Mhm.
that's the thing. They want to have financial security going forward, or they want to be, and I should go back and say that like Sankara is no longer over Jacobin. He works for the Nation now. He's like the president of the Nation, which in and of itself has done and said some stuff that's like not exactly leftist on multiple levels as well. But I think that there's a risk at there's a risk with that leadership vacuum. And I'm not just saying Bernie, I'm saying like a lot of leftist leaders who have kind of gone into the shadows. They're not as vocal anymore. They're not doing anything. And I feel like that kind of populist leftism that was surging for a moment has been dampened. And I worry about what's going to come in its wake, especially under the pandemic conditions, because those have limited, and clearly, as I've mentioned already, that has also like shown the kind of inability of the left to respond adequately to things right now, and also to respond to issues within its own ranks. Like, why are leftists being indifferent to ableism? You know what I'm saying? Like, why are they indifferent to the needs of disabled or chronically ill people? or Black people, for example. Like, and just to be clear, like there's overlap in these groups that I'm mentioning, right? But why are they so willing to throw trans people under the bus, or poor Black people being targeted by police under the bus, or whatever? It's confusing to someone who says, but look at the books, guys, look at the stuff that we read and we talk about all the time, right? How are you, on the one hand, one day you're reading Marx or like Angela Davis or something, and then the next minute you're talking about, I don't really like, I'm going to throw this group under the bus so that I can appeal to the right. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And I think, I mean, obviously people are hypocrites, right? That part makes sense. But I think on a movement level, it's confusing and it's frustrating. And you and I have talked about this ad nauseum, because like when we read stuff, in the past, and some books that we've discussed and whatnot, and we've seen how these movements cycle in and out, because there are people who are self-interested, and because at the end of the day, capitalism is a really powerful system, and the institutions that exist to support it are going to do whatever they need to survive. And that part of that process means like destroying the movements that criticize it and want to destroy it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
functioning as intended, basically.
Yeah, no, I think you're very correct about the leadership vacuum on the left, and how the risks and dangers and problems that poses. And I think obviously we like, it's leaderships of radical movement is also a dangerous place to be. Like, the US has systemically and meticulously either destroyed the lives or literally killed the people that have rose up in these situations and took in leadership positions, historically speaking. And so like, and even more contemporarily speaking, as far as leaders of Ferguson mysteriously dying and other movements around that time,
Right.
and all following that died under mysterious or controversial circumstances and stuff. And like, one of the things that crystallized this for me, and I'll try to be as careful as I can when I say this so that I don't get misunderstood, but that, like, I don't know if you've caught any of the news about the guy Andrew Tate. Does that,
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so essentially, like, the left doesn't have an Andrew Tate, not in all the negative aspects of what he brings, but, and not to make him seem as though he's a positive person in any meaningful way, but
Mm-hmm.
that what he's good at is presenting a message of what he wants people to believe, and to encourage them and to get them to do that. Now, I'm not saying that we need to mimic his techniques or his strategies or anything,
Right.
and definitely not any of his actual recommendations, but that the left needs somebody who can articulate and capture the imagination, and like, so that people can see themselves in a future built by the leftism that they're practicing.
And we need the message too. Like, we need an easily conveyable and digestible message. And I think that there's a lack of that in a lot of ways on the left in the US right now.
Not in a reductive way to dilute or
Right.
disembody the message, but in a way that any working class person can pick up what you're talking about in a couple sentences without having to have
just clarity. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
mm-hmm.
and be able to connect it to their life and why it matters to them and those things. Like, that aspect is not about sloganeering, for the sake of like capitalism, of selling people something that they don't want. It's about creating, like you said, concise clarity, those types of things. And I feel like that is definitely missing. And I feel like Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, was that in a lot of ways. When I go back and watch his speeches, like, he was that kind of bombastic, and like, he had a way to capture your attention and to get you invested in the future he was painting in a way that the left is sorely lacking now. And I mean, like I said, can't dismiss or disregard the fact that there are institutional systemic powers operating against somebody like that from rising, and also co-opting any ones that do start to look like they're doing that. But also that it does seem as though that there is just a dearth, and like, regardless of the reason, it's a problem that has to be addressed.
I agree 100%. And I I have to just say, obviously, to anyone who's like interested in international policy, or some our listeners who are like listening from other parts of the world, like, my apologies that we've been so US centric. Obviously, there are leftists and leftist movements around the world that do have, I would say, like, more defined leaders and more defined messages, and that are, I don't want to say thriving, because they're certainly under threat. But we do see them coming up in the ranks again. We look at, and again, not no one is perfect. I just want to clarify that. Like, I'm not, anyone that I present during this discussion is not perfect, because we're not talking about gods. We're talking about human beings, right? We're talking about human beings who are operating in a capitalist system and trying to survive in that capitalist system, who are deeply flawed and making mistakes. But I do think that, like, if you look to Latin America, there are lots of movements afoot, some that have been electoral and some otherwise, that are very progressive, or, like, socialist, let's just call it what it is. But they too are facing really serious challenges. And whether that's co-opting or like literal challenges in terms of like attempted coups, like what's going on in Brazil, or what just happened in Brazil, but is, I would argue, an ongoing process, not something that just can be distilled into January 8th. And to be clear, I'm going to discuss that with another guest in the future, so be on the lookout for that. But I do think that, if we look elsewhere and we learn from, as you already mentioned, learn from past figures, but also look beyond the borders of the US and learn from current day figures in other places, there, and even, I would argue, perhaps within the US, but the people that we might be ignoring, or that might not be getting public support because they come from a marginalized background or something. You know what I'm saying? Like Stokely Carmichael, as a Black man, and not only that, but like a Black immigrant, is going to be a different kind of figure, perhaps for you and me, as he would be to like a larger white audience in the US. You know what I'm saying? So I think sometimes there are plenty of people who have great messages and who are clear and who are important and who did a lot of amazing things, or are continuing to do a lot of amazing things, that people just ignore because they don't fit into the idea that has been constructed of what a quote unquote leader looks like, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you could have a Black candidate or a Latina candidate or something, and a white candidate, a white male candidate, and they're all saying the same thing, and more people are going to vote for the white male candidate, right? Just by virtue of what we've been taught to believe means, is like how leadership is defined, even on the left, because the left is also susceptible to these old school Eurocentric sexist notions of what leadership means. And so I think there is room for us to learn, but I think people need to be more cognizant of their biases and what's limiting us from seeing some of that clarity, maybe, or messages or things like that we could learn from, and why that is. And that's not a diss at you, by the way. I'm talking about just like the general American public, but also the American left, US American left, to be even more clear, where we have some drawbacks and things that need to be worked out before we move forward, or that need to certainly be worked out as we're moving forward, perhaps I should say. On that note, that very cheery, happy note, I know that I don't have much more to say, but I think this is a discussion that like is ongoing for you and me, right? Like it's something that we often come back to. And I think for this year in particular, perhaps, is something that we should continue as a theme, like what is the message, and how can we make that clear, and what are some of the things that we're reading, or people that we're listening to, or like guests that we're talking to, histories that we're learning about, that perhaps imparted a message that might be obscured for whatever reason, and how can we bring that to light through the podcast and through our own everyday actions. Because I think I really fear that a lot of stuff is getting buried and will continue to get buried if we don't do something to kind of like bring it to the light, as a collective. So that's my last thought.
Yeah, just on the leadership vacuum, I think one aspect of it is that the society that we live in doesn't raise people to prominence that are embracing socialist values. So it's like it's hard to become successful enough to reach a level of leadership without undermining the very things that you're claiming to carry to leadership. And so like it's it's very difficult. Like whoever is going to end up stepping up, and ideally it would be multiple people, not a singular person, for multiple reasons. There's besides the counter-revolutionary aspects of it, there are other reasons that socialism strives for leaderless movements in general, or like tries to avoid like leadership hierarchies generally. And so like whoever does end up taking on that role, and whoever they are, is going to have to be like have their arm twisted into it. Like anybody that's going to be seeking it out isn't going to be what we need.
No.
It's gonna have it's gonna need to be somebody who is raised through that by nature of the effectiveness of their work, and and people being like, hey, you have too many good ideas for us to let you sit on the sidelines. You have to take a more prominent role in this, and we need you to do that. Like that's how it's gonna have to happen.
Right.
Like I said, if they're seeking it, they're not gonna have what they need, even if they have the best intentions.
It's like we've talked about this, and we talked about this a little bit with our Freire episode too, but like the organic intellectual that Gramsci talks about, like it has to be someone from the community. It has to be someone who understands the problems. It has to be someone who is really deeply connected with what's going on, and not just, again, like this kind of top down traditional process.
And that's just mutually exclusive from being successful at what's deemed as successful in this country. So it's like leadership will have to come from someone that is not considered successful within the paradigm of U.S. capitalism.
I think that's a really important point and a good place to stop. But I want you to hold that thought, Richard, because I feel like this idea is something, like I said, that we should explore for the rest of the year, to be honest.
As I'm saying it, I'm thinking it's like I have work to do.
Right, like I gotta go make that money. I'm just kidding, but anyway, yes, this is great. Thank you so much for like talking to me again. You and I have not had a chance to talk in months, so it's been really nice.
Very happy. I said far too long. Very happy to be able to share this time with you.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard. And thank you all for listening. Be safe out there. As I said before in the previous podcast, make sure that if you're indoors, that you're wearing a KN95, a KF94, or an N95, or if you're outdoors and you're in close proximity to others, because we have to do our best to limit the spread and the contraction of the coronavirus, aka COVID-19, our little friend that's been with us for several years now. We're entering year 4 of the COVID pandemic, and I would like to see it slow down, but it just keeps speeding up. So let's do our parts to kind of limit the spread on a community level. And if you all have any questions about where to get masks, or if you need access to masks or testing, anything like that, please feel free to contact me either through the Left POC page or through my personal Twitter page, which is @MuseWendy. And as always, you can see and learn more about the Left Pocket Project podcast by going to @LeftPOC on any of your social media faves, except for Instagram. We're not on Instagram yet because I don't take that many pictures. But maybe one day we'll have a Left POC Instagram page. But yeah, y'all, stay safe. Thank you so much for listening, and have a good one.
Thank you all. Stay safe out there.
And thank you for listening to the Left Pocket Project podcast. As per usual, you can check us out by searching for simply Left POC on any of your social media faves, and of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And definitely take a stop over at patreon.com/leftpoc to support the podcast financially. But know, of course, that all content on the Patreon is always free. Thanks so much, and have a good one.